It's been just over 3 years since the disastrous launch of Cyberpunk 2077.
Hot damn. Done and gone.
A game that had been my most anticipated of all time. I had already stopped pre-ordering games back then, but surely the developers of The Witcher 3 wouldn't let me down. They had built their brand on impeccable quality and unparalleled respect for the players after all. Well, we all know the rest of that story. And like many, I set the game down just a couple hours in after realizing I'd been had. I knew then that it would be a long time before Cyberpunk would be an enjoyable video game, if it ever would be. Well folks, it's been a long time. Maybe too long. But I can confidently say that Cyberpunk 2077 is finally what I had always hoped it would be. And more importantly, it's finally able to present the deep and vibrant cast of Night City and their stories as always intended.
Well, that's right.
Now before I go any further, I want to establish a couple of things up front. First, I'll be avoiding major plot spoilers as best I can, but I will be talking about a handful of major characters and their relationship with the protagonist. Given the nature of the story and its characters, I'm still going to give a spoiler warning and highly recommend playing the game for yourself if you want to go in blind. With that said, the story has so many branching narratives as well as such an expansive and well-written cast that I'm sure you'll still find plenty of incredible moments to discover for yourself even if you choose to watch this video first. Second, as I already mentioned, I was one of the many burned by the leadership at CDPR when this game first launched. However, I want this video to be about Cyberpunk as it is today, not the dumpster fire it was then. So that's the last negative comment I'll be making. I instead want to give praise to the hardworking people who were no doubt even more devastated by that initial version of the game than myself or any other eager fans.
Now that's good business sense.
Third and last, this game is absolutely massive and I simply could not explore the whole thing in the time between projects or collect all my thoughts on it in just one video. So with that in mind, this video won't cover any content specifically featured in the expansion Phantom Liberty and will be focusing on characters encountered relatively early on. If you'd like to see more content on Cyberpunk, and Phantom Liberty in particular, let me know in the comments down below. And without further ado, I present. Now, I know what you're thinking, and no, I don't mean intimacy in a romantic sense, though the game certainly makes room for that kind as well. What I'm talking about is in how the game places such a large focus on incredibly believable and oftentimes personal interactions with the characters. This is achieved with phenomenal writing and acting, as well as meaningful and believable dialogue choices. I have never given this much thought and consideration to dialogue choices in a game before, and that's in large part because I was invested in what I chose to say for the sake of how characters would respond to V, and by extension myself. Small aside, but bear with me for a moment. I play and watch most things with subtitles on, and in games I like the choice to read ahead and skip the dialogue. I've actually been trying to break that habit so viewers of my streams and videos can both watch and listen to scenes play out as the developers intended. My point here is that in spite of my impulse to skip ahead, I almost never wanted to skip even a single line of dialogue in Cyberpunk, because doing so felt legitimately rude. This may sound absurd, but it's as if to skip ahead would be interrupting a real person. I cannot give enough praise to the writers, actors, and animators who brought these characters to life, as they are hands down some of the best I've ever encountered in video games. Even the body language and tone of delivery were handled with a finesse that often left me stunned. Everyone, including the player character V, just feels so well written and performed that I can't think of any other game which has so thoroughly immersed me in simply conversing with its characters. And that's today, 3 years post-launch. Not to downplay how long I've waited to experience this story and its characters, but I imagine those elements remain largely unchanged since launch. Had I experienced them as intended back then, as part of a functional and fun video game, Cyberpunk 2077 would likely have become one of my favorites ever made. I think I've made my point given how lengthy this section has been, so rather than drag things out any longer, let me introduce the first character I want to talk about, Goro Takamura.
Yeah, they tell you that you should quit trying. You were too small, that you were too young. They tell you the chance is too slim, the world is too big, but you say how come? I'm ready to light a new fire, raise a new flag to cross a new sea. And if I'm ever the one in your way, then put your head down and run right through me. I keep settling for so much less. Don't take what's given, just demand what's next.
Anyone familiar with the game should recognize this proverb-spouting sci-fi samurai, and for good reason. This man makes a very strong first impression as an intense and intimidating bodyguard for one of the major antagonists of the game, Saburo Arasaka. But it's his second major appearance and our first proper introduction to the man that really made him an instant favorite of mine. Enemy and by enemy and all that jazz. While I think some people may jump to criticize him as a caricature or a stereotype, when juxtaposed against the other Japanese characters in this game, I ultimately found him endearing and complex. I say that as a 4th generation Japanese American, aka Yonsei, who is all too aware of the cyberpunk genre's tumultuous relationship with Japanese representation. I won't go into that here because frankly smarter people have done it better, but I'll leave a link to a great video on the topic in the description. My point is that the more I played Cyberpunk, the more I felt that it was truly great in its handling of an IP and genre that is existentially tied to discrimination. Where lesser games and media might include a pandering nod towards a social issue or use it to virtue signal in a way even the staunchest progressives find distasteful, Cyberpunk takes the opportunity to balance the outdated fears incited by Japan's economic boom of the late 70s and 80s with complex Japanese characters performed by Japanese people. I personally connected with characters like Takamura and the fixer Wakako because as silly as it may sound, their accents in the bonsai tree in the back of the latter's small office reminded me of family. I've played a lot of Japanese video games over the years, but it was this game from a Polish studio that for the first time presented me with characters who reminded me of my grandfather. I actually thought of my grandpa quite often while spending time with Takamura, as he's a 2nd generation Japanese American, or Nisei, whose story in many ways mirrors that of our friend Goro's. You see, my grandfather was born in the United States, the son of 2 Japanese immigrants, and despite being an American citizen, he spent a number of years during his childhood mired in the poverty and discrimination of an internment camp. In spite of that, he later went on to have a long and distinguished career serving as an officer in the US military. So when I learned that Takamura grew up in a slum under the watchful eye of the Arasaka Corporation, only to be recruited into their ranks and serve a long and distinguished career himself, well, the parallels were obvious. I often wondered if representation was as big a deal as I've been led to believe, and in saying that, I feel a bit ignorant and guilty writing about how it felt spending time with a character like Goro Takamura. So on that note, I'd like to say to anyone who doesn't feel represented in the games they love, I'm sorry for not understanding sooner, because I have no doubt in my mind that a meaningful part of how much I enjoyed this game was getting to spend time with a badass Japanese super soldier who in more than a few ways reminded me of my grandfather. Moving along, but still on the topic of representation, the second character I want to discuss is Claire. We first meet Claire in the prologue at the afterlife where she's a bartender. I didn't really take notice of her until I started a side quest to be her driver in a series of Mad Max-inspired death races. She's fearless, funny, and comes across as a really down-to-earth person who just loves cars, racing, and a bit of violence to boot. So then, when we find out she's not only participating in the races for a chance at the finals, but for the opportunity to kill the man she blames for her late husband's death, I was a bit shocked but ultimately sympathetic. The way she talks about him and his love of machines was a real tearjerker for me. You can tell that she misses him and carries on in spite of that like only someone who truly loved their partner could. So then it was all the more moving to hear her casually mention that a big part of what made them so close was how her husband had been one of the first people to support her when she transitioned. Now I understand why the mention of a trans woman in a video game might make your eyes roll. If you're a colossal piece of shit, that is. I don't want this video to be all about representation because my real focus is on the game's writing and performances. However, I do want to draw attention to the fact that I found the representation and diversity on display in this game to be truly refreshing in a way that at all times felt natural to the world and the narrative, which is a direct result of the high caliber writing and acting on display in Cyberpunk 2077. It never felt like a character was made to be a certain race or gender specifically to tick some box on a virtue signal checklist. The writers and actors who brought these characters to life did so with such success because they were written as people, not identities. I specifically wondered if the fact that I had no idea Claire was a trans character until she mentioned it in passing was a good or a bad thing. And like all things, I think it depends on the context. In the context of a game that has clearly made an effort to include a diverse cast of well-written characters, I think it's a good thing, and my token trans friend Lemon agrees, giving this representation a shockingly high gender diversity score of 4 out of 5 Zers. Okay, they didn't say that, but they laughed when I sent them that line from the script, so it stayed in. Now, regardless of how you may feel about it personally, I believe it's only responsible to give a thorough disclaimer and content warning for the section that follows. The characters in this game are portrayed in ways that are shockingly real. That is in no small part due to how the writing is respectful yet unflinching in its depiction of some of the darkest elements of the human experience. This includes, but is not limited to, sexual assault, mental illness, and suicide. I don't believe I can give this game or its writers the credit they deserve without talking about how they tackle these challenging and sensitive topics. In keeping with that, I've done my best to treat these matters with the respect they likewise deserve. However, I completely understand if you'd rather skip this heavy section. Timestamp on screen and in the description if you'd like to skip this part. To really make this point, I need to talk about a pair of key characters the player is introduced to early on in the story, Judy and Evelyn. Doing so requires some setup and explanation, so bear with me for a moment. We're first introduced to Evelyn in the game's prologue, where she's a client who hires V to steal an experimental biochip, which subsequently sets in motion the events of the rest of the game. After the job goes horribly wrong, and our boy Goro pulls us out of the trash with a bullet still in our head, she becomes one of our primary leads in getting some answers. Evelyn was at first someone I found somewhat forgettable, an intelligent and manipulative person in a world where one would expect a lot of intelligent and manipulative people. Yet I found the confidence she navigated the world with to be refreshing, which made it all the more awful to see that burned out of her. Evelyn did, however, quickly grow on me after she introduced me to her friend in the chair, Judy, who teaches us about brain dances. Judy is my ride or die in this game, and she's 100% nerd, both interested in tech and excited to discuss it with another nerd, but also deeply paranoid and painfully aware of the risks she faces given her line of work, which turns out is more than justified given the events that follow in the wake of Evelyn convincing her to help us. When she opens up in the subtle ways she does, I really felt like I got to know her as a person, not just a character, and I wanted to help the same people she did, which in a roundabout way led me to also being pretty invested in Evelyn's well-being. This is all to say that by the time I had finished the prologue, Judy and Evelyn had made a small but lasting impression on me, and Judy in particular remains in the running for my favorite character in Cyberpunk 2077. Now, having established how invested I was in these two characters from very early on, I want to talk about why they're still on my mind as I write and record this. After the prologue, the player can go looking for Evelyn to ask her about the botched job. After it's clear we can't find her, we're led back to Judy, who also doesn't know where Evelyn is. So we then end up working with Judy to track down her missing friend. The search for Evelyn took me down a rabbit hole that honestly just grew more and more disturbing as we got closer to finding her. So when V scooped her up and carried her out of the hell she'd been trapped in, I felt a sense of deep relief that I haven't experienced outside of the most intense horror games. But as I mentioned earlier, what really made these characters special for me was in how I felt compelled to think about them as real people. After finding Evelyn and taking her to safety, she remains unresponsive and nonverbal, clearly traumatized by what she's been through. Before V checks on her, Judy tells us that there was an unexplained chunk of time in which Evelyn was missing. Upon studying it, she discovers that Evelyn was sexually assaulted by her boss for days. This is not the first time a game has mentioned sexual assault, but it is the first time the choice to do so has left a crater in my stomach. We previously met her boss, and I believed his spiel about looking out for the women he employed at the club. Despite mowing through his henchmen without remorse, I had let this monster live. Even though I knew it was just a game, I couldn't help but feel guilty. And that feeling of guilt, the ability for a game to draw that from me, I cannot understate how powerful that is. V then checks on Evelyn, and after she proves still unresponsive, we're given a chance to reach out and touch her or get up and leave. Now, the thoughts and feelings this elicited from me were truly remarkable. This game made Evelyn feel so real to me that I stopped to consider for a moment. She was a sex worker and now a victim of sexual assault. The last thing she would want was our male character touching her. So instead, we got up and left. But we're not done with being emotionally shaken by Evelyn and Judy, not quite. Because after some time, we get an emergency call from Judy telling us to get to her place ASAP. My mind went to the same place many of yours may have the second she mentions Evelyn. Unfortunately, we arrive on an awful scene, but not an unexpected one. Judy sits on the edge of a bathtub looking down at a lifeless Evelyn, clearly having taken her own life. Now, I am fortunate to say I have never personally lost someone to suicide, but I have had the terrible privilege of being a bystander to tragedy for much of my life. I've experienced no shortage of attempts, both failed and not, by people I or my loved ones cherish. I have had a front row seat to witness the grief that comes with losing someone to mental illness. I mean this with all the sincerity and respect in my heart. It was not unlike watching these events through V's eyes as he took on that all too familiar role of a bystander. I felt anger and sadness and helplessness and guilt all at once as Judy raged at the police while trying desperately to treat someone she loves with dignity in their final moments. I don't know if I have the right words to describe this scene. All I can say to express how I felt is that I don't think that I will ever forget it. And in that moment, I knew with 100% certainty that it was written and performed by people who understand the gravity of what they're portraying. and most importantly, who cared enough to do it justice. Okay, so that was a lot, and it wasn't easy to write or record, so I'm right there with you. But I really do believe that if we want games and the people who make them to tackle the more difficult parts of life and our human experiences, we have to give them credit where it's due when they take the creative and financial risk that comes with presenting complex or distressing topics to an increasingly media illiterate population. I have a lot of conflicting feelings about Cyberpunk 2077. A game that both shattered what remaining faith I once had in the motivations and ambitions of AAA game development, and yet somehow successfully managed to redeem itself all these years later. I can't separate the unmitigated disappointment I felt long after this game's release from my understanding and experiences with it as a whole. My thoughts and feelings regarding how we should discuss games that find themselves in this increasingly common but no less frustrating cycle are too numerous to bother with for the time being. So in light of all that, I will say to Cyberpunk 2077 and everyone who worked to redeem this game so that its wonderful world and incredible cast could get the recognition they deserve, thank you and apology accepted.
So what you think?
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ding the little bell if you want to be notified of my next video. I also do variety game streaming 5 days a week starting at 12 PM Pacific Standard Time, which is where I capture my gameplay footage used in these videos and play through the games covered on this channel. Link to my Twitch channel, Discord, and more in the description. Thanks again, and see you next time.